On May 2nd, in the year 1287, all the Jews of England were apprehended by the king's command for a cause not known, and they ransomed themselves for 20,000 pounds of silver. They then had a synagogue at Canterbury. Fabian writes that the Jews of England were fined at great sums of money, perhaps for the cause of their seizure, which they paid to the king. But other authors say that the Commons of England granted to the king the 5th part of their movable goods, on condition that the Jews should be banished out of the land, for which cause the said Jews, to persuade the Commons from their purpose, freely gave great sums of money to the king, which saying appears to be true, for that the said Jews. The Jews were exiled within a few years afterward, with whom Grafton and Holinshed agree. This was strong evidence of the power of Jewish money, which had overpowered the whole Commons of England in Parliament, and of their generous subsidy for their banishment afterward. About this year, as I judge, the statutes of Edward I, entitled De Judaismo, were made and published, printed in French in Toddle's Magna Charta, Anno 1556, Part 2, Folios 58 and 59. Because these statutes are not printed in English, I shall here insert and translate them. The Statute de Judaismo. 1. Because the king has seen that many harms and injuries to honest men of this land have occurred by the usuries which the Jews have practiced in times past, and that many sins have arisen from this, although he and his ancestors have formerly gained great profit from the Jews, nevertheless, for the honor of God and for the common benefit of the people, the king ordains and establishes that no Jew from this time forward shall take usury upon lands, rents, or upon any other thing, and that no usury shall run from the feast of St. Edward, last past and before. The contracts previously made shall stand, except that the usuries themselves shall cease. Provided that all those who are indebted to Jews upon movable pledges shall discharge their debts between this and Easter next following, and if not, let the pledges be forfeited. And if any Jew shall take usury against this ordinance, the king neither by himself nor by any of his officers will assist him to recover the debt or the usury, but will punish him at his pleasure for the trespass, and will do right to the Christian to recover his pledge. 2. And it is provided that the distraints for the debt of Jews shall not henceforth be so severe that the moiety, half, of lands and chattels of Christians shall not remain for their sustenance, and that no distraint shall be made for the debt of a Jew upon the heir of the debtor, named in the Jews' charter, nor upon another who holds the land, which was the debtor's, before the debt shall be brought and acknowledged in court. And if the sheriff or other bailiffs, by command of the king, must make seizure to a Jew for debt, whether of chattels or lands, to the value of the debt, the chattels shall be appraised by the oath of honest men and delivered to the Jew or Jewess, or to their attorney, to the value of the debt. And if the chattels are insufficient, the lands shall be extended, valued, by the same oath before the seizure is delivered, everyone according to the value, so that the debt may afterward be certainly known to be discharged, and so that the Christian afterward may keep half of his lands and chattels for his sustenance, as is aforesaid, and the chief house. 3. And if anything stolen at any time shall be found in the possession of a Jew, and any will sue for it, let the Jew have his summons if he may have it. And if not, he shall answer so that he shall never be privileged for it otherwise than a Christian. 4. And that all Jews shall reside in the cities and boroughs which belong to the king, where the chest for Jewish indentures is customarily kept, and that every Jew, after he is 7 years of age, shall wear a sign or badge on his outer garment, that is to say, in the form of 2 tablets of yellow felt, of the length of 6 fingers and the breadth of 3 fingers, or handbreadths, and that everyone after he is 12 years old shall pay 3 pence poll tax every year to the king, which shall be paid at Easter. And this shall be understood as well of women as of men, and that no Jew shall have power to alienate or convey another's lands or chattels contrary to these provisions. Nor shall any Jew or Christian alienate or transfer their houses, rents, or revenues, which they have now purchased, nor convey them in any way, nor issue a release to any Christian for a debt owed to them, without the king's special license, unless the king has otherwise ordered. 6. And because Holy Church desires and permits that they should live and be protected, the king takes them into his protection, grants them his peace, and wills that they shall live, and shall be guarded and defended by his sheriffs and other bailiffs and by his lieges. He commands that none shall do them harm or injury, nor use force against their persons or their goods, movable or immovable. And they shall not be sued, summoned, or challenged in any court except in the king's court, wherever they may be. 7. And none of them shall be required to answer or render rent to anyone except the king and his bailiffs in his name, except for houses which they now hold that render rent, saving the right of Holy Church. 8. And the king grants that they may live by lawful trade and by their labor, and that they may deal with Christians lawfully in selling and buying. But by this privilege, or any other, they shall not live in idleness or loafing among them. And the king wills that, because of their trade, they shall not be placed in tolls, customs, or tallages together with those of the cities or boroughs where they reside, since they are answerable to the king as his own vassals, and to no other. 9. Moreover, the king grants that they may buy houses and plots in the cities or boroughs where they live, as they hold them in chief of the king, saving to the lords the services due and customary. 10. And that they may take lands to farm for a term of 6 years or less, without taking homage or fealty or rendering service of a Christian, and without the consent of Holy Church, in order to support their lives in the world, if they do not know how to trade or are unable to labor. And this power to take lands to farm shall not endure to them longer than 15 years from this time forward. By these laws, this political king, to please his English Christian subjects, who desired and pressed for the banishment of the Jews in Parliament, reduced many of their former privileges and placed many new restraints upon them. Yet, on the other hand, to gratify the Jews, who gave him more money than the English to remain here longer, he took them all into his special protection, forbade all violence against their persons or property, and granted them some small privileges for the present, which seemed to content them and were made more for his own advantage than for theirs. King Edward I, the next year, 1288, being in Gascony, a certain English knight decreed to bring a Jew to court for the unlawful detention of a certain manor, mortgaged to him, before the judges. But the crafty Jew refused to answer, claiming a charter of King Henry previously granted to him, by which he was not to be brought into judgment before any judge except before the king himself. The knight, troubled by this, went into Gascony to obtain a remedy from the king. When the king heard this, he answered, "It is not fitting for children to undo the deeds of their parents, to whom by God's law they are commanded to give reverence. Therefore I have decreed not to make void the deed of my father. But I grant to you, and to the rest of my realm, that by the same law, lest a Jew be considered better than a Christian, that for any injury whatsoever done to the Jew, so long as he enjoys his charter, you shall not be brought before any judge, except myself. The knight returned with this privilege, and the Jew, realizing the danger hanging over his head, voluntarily renounced his charter, surrendered the benefit of that privilege, and wished that both parties might be subject to the common law. The following year, 1289, King Edward, taking upon himself the cause of the crown at Blackford in Gascony, immediately banished all the Jews out of Gascony and out of all the other lands he possessed in the realm of France as enemies of the cross. From there, he returned into England in the year 1290 and was joyfully received at London by both the clergy and the people. And that same year, he likewise expelled the Jews out of England, giving them expenses to go into France and confiscating the remainder of their goods. On what grounds? By what authority? For what length of time? In what manner? With what desire and with what consent of the whole commons and realm of England the Jews were then banished from there? These following historians relate at large in their own words, which I shall transcribe for better information and satisfaction of all sorts of men, whether Christians or Jews. Matthew of Westminster, flourishing at that time, gives this account. About those days, namely on the 31st of August, the remaining multitude of Jews, who in times past had dwelt securely in various cities and strongholds, by royal command were ordered, with their wives and children together with their movable goods, to depart out of England about the Feast of All Saints, which was assigned to them as the deadline. They dared not transgress this order under pain of hanging. Their whole number was estimated at 16,511 persons. Such a decree had already been issued by the King of England in the parts of Aquitaine, from which all the Jews were likewise banished. Thomas Walsingham, who lived near that time, records this. The king, returning out of Gascony to London, was solemnly received by the clergy and all the people, who in the same year, after banishing all the Jews out of England and providing them expenses into France, confiscated the rest of their goods. That same year the king held a parliament, in which were made the statutes called Westminster the Third. In that parliament, likewise concerning the expulsion of the Jews, it was granted to the king by the people a 15th part of their goods. Henry de Knighton, a canon of Leicester and a diligent antiquarian, writing in the reign of Richard II, renders it in these terms: King Edward severely punished the Jews and their associates for clipping of money and corrupt exchanges, whereupon, in one day, he caused all the Jews to be apprehended, some to be hanged, the rest to be banished. When he had done his will upon his corrupt judges, he presently caused a parliament to be assembled concerning money, which was found to have been basely clipped and corrupted, to the prejudice of the crown and the great damage of the people. By this parliament, the expulsion of the Jews was debated and resolved. It was established that all Jews should depart out of the realm of England and never return afterward, for their incredulity chiefly, and for their falseness, which had scarcely been pressed upon them. And for this reason, their banishment was ordered to be carried out swiftly and without delay. The commons of the realm gave to the king 1/5 of all their movable goods. John Major and the chroniclers of Magdeburg after him thus recorded it for posterity. In the year 1290, the Jews were banished out of England because the English complained to King Edward that by their usuries and frauds, many people, especially those of lower rank, had been reduced to nothing, which was harmful to the king. Therefore the commons granted the king a 15th penny, so that he might banish the Jews. Our learned authorities, John Bale, Polydore Virgil, and the writers of that century, express it thus. In the Parliament held at London, a debate was first raised concerning the banishment of the Jews. There was a great multitude assembled throughout England, and a public decree was issued by common consent. All the Jews were commanded to depart the realm with their goods, and they obediently and promptly complied with the command of Parliament. To these Latin authors one might add Thomas Stubbs in his Acts of the Archbishops of Canterbury, who notes this universal banishment from all England in a single day. But I will proceed with the more commonly cited English historians. Fabian in his Chronicle, John Fox in his Acts and Monuments, and Richard Grafton in his Chronicle all report it nearly in the same words, that in this year 1290, all Jews were completely banished from the realm of England, for which the Commons granted the king a 15th. Nicholas Trivet, in his Polychronicon, and William Caxton record that after the king had done his will upon the Jews, both by imprisonment and execution, he expelled them from the realm, accusing them of falseness and usury. Thus a solemn act of Parliament was passed among the lords, decreeing that all Jews should depart out of England for their unbelief, and also for the false usury they practiced among Christian men. And to speedily bring this matter to an end, the Commons of England gave the king the 15th of all their movable goods, and the Jews were driven out of England. When the Jews entered into France, they settled there by the permission of King Philip, who was then King of France. Raphael Holinshed, in his Chronicle, reports the same. In that same year, a parliament was held at Westminster, in which the statutes of Westminster III were enacted. It was also decreed that all Jews should be expelled from the land. In consideration of this, a 15th was granted to the king, and so the Jews were banished from all the king's dominions, and never afterward were they permitted to return by any privilege. All their immovable goods were confiscated, together with their bonds and obligations. However, their movable goods, together with their gold and silver, were allowed to be taken with them by the king's license. Some of the richest among them were shipped out with their treasure in a large, tall ship they had hired. While the tide was out, the ship went down the Thames toward the mouth of the river beyond Queenborough. The ship's master waited for the tide, cast anchor, and caused the Jews to disembark and walk on land for recreation. And when he realized the tide to be coming in, he got him back to the ship, whether he was pulled out by a rope or by a cord. The Jews did not think the danger was as great as it truly was, because they were unaware of it. But when they realized how serious the situation was, they cried out to him for help. He told them they ought to cry out to Moses, by whose command their fathers had been delivered from the Red Sea, and through whom, if they would call upon him for help, he might be able to help them out of these rising floods that had now overtaken them. They cried out indeed, but no rescue appeared, and so they were swallowed up in the water. The man afterward returned with the ship and told the king how the matter had gone and how they had been drowned, as some writers report. But others affirm, more harshly it would seem, that several of those mariners who dealt so wickedly with the Jews were later hanged for their wrongdoing, and that this was done as a just punishment for their fraudulent and unjust dealings. John Stowe, in his Annals, page 204, writes of this matter as follows. King Edward banished all the Jews out of England, giving them time to sell their property before they left the realm. The number of Jews expelled was 15,000 men and women. Their houses being sold, the king received an immense sum of money. John Speed, in his History of Great Britain, page 545, describes the expulsion this way. King Edward, in the year 1290, to purge England of usury, corruption, and oppression, as he claimed, banished the Jews out of the realm, confiscating all their goods and leaving them nothing but money to pay their travel expenses. Thus, by their cruel usuries, they had eaten his people to the bone. To pass over Helene's Microcosm, page 570, and Henry Isaacson's Chronology, year 1290, and others who mention this final banishment of the Jews from England. I will conclude with the words of Samuel Daniel in his History, page 160. Of no lesser grievance than corrupt judges, who were fined, displaced, and banished, this king rid the people by the banishment of the Jews, for which the kingdom willingly granted him a 15th, having previously, in the 9th year of his reign, offered a 5th part of their goods to be expelled. But afterward the Jews gave more money, and so remained until this time, which brought him great benefit through the confiscation of their immovable goods, together with their tallies and obligations, which amounted to an infinite value. But now he has made his final use of this miserable people, who, having never been protected by any other authority than the will of the prince, had continually served him in all the necessary occasions of his predecessors, but especially those of his father and himself. Sir Edward Coke, in his Second Institutes, pages 506, 507, 508, in his commentary on the Statute of Jury, seems to contradict the previously cited historians concerning their banishment, whose words I will quote at length here and respond to in this particular matter. This statute was made, he writes, in the Parliament of the 18th year of Edward I, and the mischiefs before this statute against Jewish usury were these: 1. The evils and disorders of the good men of the land. 2. That many of the sins and offenses of the realm had arisen and been committed because of it, to the great dishonor of Almighty God. And are not these 2 reasons sufficient grounds to keep them out now, as well as to restrain and banish them then? The difficulty, he adds, was how to apply a remedy, considering what great yearly revenue the king received from the usury of the Jews, and how necessary it was that the king should be supplied with treasure. What benefit the crown had before the making of this act appears from earlier records, as one example among many. From the 17th of December, in the 50th year of Henry III, until the Tuesday in Shrovetide, in the 2nd year of Edward I, which was about 7 years, the crown had £420,000, 15 shillings, and 4 pence, from the issues of jury. At that time, the ounce of silver was worth only 20 pence, whereas now it is worth more than 3 times as much. Thus the statement of the preamble is true, that he and his ancestors had received great profit from Judaism. Many provisions were made both by this king and by others. At times they were banished, but their cruel usury continued, and soon after they returned. And for the sake of profit and gain, King John, in the 2nd year of his reign, granted them broad liberties and privileges, by which the harms described in this statute were increased. But the profit and gain which King John had and expected from the unbelieving Jews made him impiously practice Judaism, for in the end he allowed them to exercise the laws of their sacrifices, which they could not do without a priesthood. The king, by his charter, granted them permission to have one, and so forth. Because of the great rarity of this, and because we find no record of it either in our books or histories, I will repeat it here, word for word. The king to all his faithful subjects, both Jews and English, greeting. Know that we have granted and confirmed to Jacob, Jew of London, presbyter of the Jews, and to all the Jewish presbyters throughout all England, that they shall have and hold, for as long as he shall live, liberty and peace, honor and dignity, fully and completely, and that no one shall presume, on this account, to bring any accusation or burden against them. Therefore we will, and firmly command, that the same Jacob, for as long as he lives, shall have charge and oversight of the Jewish presbyters throughout all England, governing and maintaining them, and peacefully defending them. And if anyone should presume to harm them or to trouble them unjustly, he shall be punished. And we forbid that anyone shall implead them before any judge other than before us or our Chief Justice. Given by our hand at Westminster the 2nd day of June, in the 1st year of our reign. Original note: this king had a most troublesome and dishonorable reign, God rising against him for his just punishment. Two powerful enemies, Pope Innocent III and Philip, King of France. And besides this, which was the worst, he lost the hearts and loyalty of his barons and subjects, and at last came to a dreadful end. He adds that our noble King Edward I, and his father Henry III before him, sought by various acts and ordinances to use some means and moderation in this matter. But in the end, it was found that there was no middle way in mischief. As Seneca says, "In wrong matters there is no proper moderation." And therefore King Edward I ordained this statute faithfully, for the honor of God and for the common benefit of his people, without regard to the filling of his own coffers, decreeing that no Jew from that time forward should make any bargain or contract for usury, nor take any usury on any former contract from the feast of St. Edward the past. Thus, in effect, all Jewish usury was forbidden. This law struck at the root of this pestilent weed, for by it usury itself was forbidden. And as a result, the cruel Jews, thinking after profit and gain, to the number of 15,000 departed out of this realm into foreign lands, where they might use the Jewish trade of usury. From that time to this day, that nation never returned again into this realm. Some are of the opinion, and so it is said in some of our histories, that it was enacted by authority of Parliament that the usurious Jews should be banished out of the realm. But the truth is that their usury was banished by this act of Parliament, and that was the cause that they banished themselves into other countries, because they could not live by their usury, so that they were not then banished by the king or Parliament, but voluntarily banished themselves upon the making of this statute against their usury. But under the favor of this deceased and reverend judge, whose memory I generally revere, this opinion of his is a clear mistake. First, this statute of Judaism was made several years before their banishment from the realm, as I previously showed, and the final clause of it, allowing them to rent houses, to continue for 15 years, clearly shows it was not made in the 18th year of Edward I. Second, no record or historian mentions that they voluntarily banished themselves because of the making of this law. Therefore, their voluntary departure cannot on this occasion be called a banishment. Third, the previously cited historians record that only a few years before their banishment, they offered a large sum of money to prevent it, urging Parliament through the Commons, with an offer of the 5th part of their goods to the king for their banishment. Therefore, it is very unlikely that they would, at the same time, voluntarily banish themselves. Fourth, all the most credible historians of later times unanimously record that they were judicially and actually banished, both by the king and Parliament, principally for their unbelief and for other related reasons, and were commanded under pain of hanging to depart the realm by a certain day, for the effecting and hastening of which the Commons gave the king a 15th. Therefore they were not banished by themselves alone. Who should be more trusted than this judge's single opinion? 5th, his own later words and records directly contradict this opinion of his no fewer than 10 times, which I wonder he did not notice. I shall recite them fully, to avoid misleading the overly trusting readers of the Long Robe, who take his words and works as oracles. Though in many matters they contain very serious mistakes, contradicted by the very records he himself cites, especially in his chapter on Parliament, and notably so. And for this reason, he writes that they were hated both by God and man, so that they might safely pass out of the realm in peace. They made petition to the king that a certain day might be fixed for them to depart the realm, it being fixed by the king and Parliament against their will, so that they might receive the king's writ to his sheriffs for their safe conduct, and that they might suffer no injury, molestation, damage, or grievance in the meantime, one of which writs we will now transcribe. Latin decrees summarized in English. The king to all his faithful subjects. We have set a fixed and certain time, therefore appointed by the king himself, without their petition, for the Jews to depart from our realm. We forbid that anyone should cause them harm, injury, molestation, damage, or grievance within the appointed time. And if it happens that they come with their goods and chattels to the ports of London for transfer, we command that safe passage and proper conduct be provided for them. Provided that the Jews, before their departure, satisfy Christian creditors for debts lawfully owed to them, or give adequate security. Given at Westminster the 18th day of July, in the 18th year of Edward I. This statute de Judaismo was made at the Parliament held after Easter term in the 18th year of Edward I, at which Parliament the king received a 15th for the expulsion of the Jews. Therefore, by his own admission, they were banished by the king and Parliament against their will, and a 15th was granted for it, as earlier historians note. And this was granted afterward in pursuance of their judgment of banishment, not upon their petition. The king began his reign in November. The Parliament understood, contrary to a strange opinion of a judge, that by banning usury alone, and not the Jews themselves, the Jews would not leave. Therefore, by this means, this noble king banished forever these unbelieving, usurious Jews. Thus, their persons, as well as usury itself, were banished. And the number of Jews thus banished was 15,300. We will here add a parliamentary record from the prior of Bridlington, as follows. And whereas the said prior acknowledged that the said sum of money, previously debated with the Jew, namely £300, was not paid to him before the exile of the Jews, therefore by this parliamentary record, about 3 years later they were judicially banished by Parliament, not voluntarily by themselves, nor by any law of banishment. And that the said sum of money, being owed, was paid to the Lord King after their exile, again repeated. It is therefore to be considered that the Lord King recovered the said money. And it was said to the same prior that he did not leave the said vill until the said money was fully paid to the Lord King. And John, Archbishop of York, responded that the said prior had committed fraud and deceit against the king by receiving the said money contrary to the faith and allegiance owed to the Lord King. Likewise, in another roll, in the 23rd year of Edward I, Roll 5. Therefore, by these 3 records cited by himself, the Jews were all banished by sentence of Parliament, in such manner as our historians record, and not merely by his new opinion alone, which amounts only to a refusal, By all the concurrent testimonies, it is clear against Sir Edward Coke's groundless idea. First, that all the Jews were then banished out of England, never to return again. At the special urging and request of the Commons in several parliaments, as an intolerable grievance and oppression under which they then complained. Second, that the principal grounds of this perpetual banishment were their unbelief, usury, forgery of charters, clipping and falsifying of coinage, by which they harmed the king and kingdom and greatly oppressed and impoverished the people. Third, that this banishment was acceptable to all the people, who had often pressed for it in Parliament, so much so that they gave the king a 1/5 and a 15th part of their movable goods to speed and carry it out. Fourth, that this banishment was by the unanimous decision, judgment, edict, and decree of both the king and his Parliament, and not by the king alone, and that this banishment was total of them all, and likewise final, never to return into England. This edict and decree, though not now extant in the Parliament rolls, many of which are lost, is nevertheless mentioned by all the authorities.